I'm going to continue us in prayer as we enter the time of preaching and hearing God's word. Bow your heads with me. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the opportunity that we get together and meet as a family here to hear your word, to share in your worship. Lord, may the meditations of our heart, may the words of our mouth remember you and praise you and be pleasing to you. Lord, help us to walk the walk that you showed us here on earth in your Son. Let us always seek after you. Lord, I ask for wisdom now. I ask for peace. And I ask for understanding as we go into this time of understanding your word. Amen. All right, howdy. Oh, there we go. I got a few howdies. So I am a middle school teacher. You probably heard that already. And I always like to begin my class that way. I tell my students that the reason is because I am from the greatest country on this planet. You want to guess where that's at? Texas. That's right. And I know I can hear my mom rolling her eyes already. But there are three things that we say in Texas. We say y'all. We say Whataburger is better than In-N-Out. That was the response from the students. And we all say howdy. And so that's how I begin my classes, and they love it, and they shout it as loud as they can, and it's a chance for them to get to talk. And so we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to be participating a little bit here in this time. You're probably used to the preacher coming up here and sharing a few words. I think that's great, but I wanted to do things maybe a little differently today. So up on the screen here in a moment, it's going to have some instructions. And being a teacher, we call this think, pair, and share. And what we're going to do is I want us to take some time to read Luke 5:12 through 16, and we'll have that up here in a moment. But first, we're going to have the instructions. Can we get those up here? Maybe is that slide there? Maybe not. That's okay. We can go straight to the Luke passage. We can bring that up on the screen. And what I want us to do, and it's okay, you know, I'm asking you to just be a little uncomfortable here and share with someone next to you. Take some time to read this, maybe 2 minutes, to slow down and read this passage. And I want you to, in the pews in front of you, you have maybe some note cards, hopefully. Take some time to write down, as you read through the passage, any thoughts, impressions, words, phrases, anything that really sticks out to you as you read this passage. Take some time, write that down, and then in just a minute, we're going to share some of those insights. So for the time being, take 2 minutes, read the passage, write down anything that sticks out to you as you read through it, and then we'll continue. So 2 minutes, go ahead and read that passage, write anything down, and then we will move into the next part.
Search me, oh God, know every thought, discern my every way, speak into my soul, point out to me my wrongs, me until I follow down a path that leads me to your way, because my heart sometimes can wonder, my faith can stray, but I know that when I fix my eyes on you, that I will always remain safe in the shadows of your grace, grace, God's grace, grace that will pardon and cleanse within, grace, grace, God's grace, the grace that is greater than
All right.
all mine.
So I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to read this for us as you were writing, maybe hopefully writing down some thoughts and ideas that came to your mind. And if you're still doing that, great. I appreciate that. And again, I'm used to working with middle schoolers, so they love talking. They love, this is kind of their way of getting focused and getting their attention and really having them dig into the word. Because I think the Holy Spirit, it's not like the preacher has more of the Holy Spirit than everyone else. And so I believe that we're going to hear in a moment some of the words of the Spirit speaking through us as a family, as members of this congregation here in just a moment. I want to see some of those insights. I want to hear some of those insights here in just a moment. So again, this is called Think, Pair, Share. So we just had the thinking part. And the passage says, while Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. When he saw Jesus, he fell on his face to the ground and begged him, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out. I'm sorry, I just lost myself. Oh, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. Then Jesus ordered him, don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priests and offer sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that the crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses. But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. And this next part is the prayer part. And this is going to be a little uncomfortable for some of us, probably, especially if you haven't had your morning coffee and you're thinking, man, I don't want to do any talking with that. But I'm asking you to trust me here a little bit. And the students love this part. So if you would, please turn to someone next to you. And I want you to share. And this is really important. I want you to remember what the person that's sharing with you says, because we're going to quiz you here in a second. So turn to the person next to you, and I want you to share whatever insights you had, wherever you wrote down, something like that. So maybe get so close to someone if you're not close to someone. Share a little bit. Go out of your comfort zone. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but it's going to be okay because we're going to trust God is working here. And share with someone next to you the insights that you had, and then we'll go from there.
Like a shepherd lead us, we need your tender care. Your pleasant pastures feed us, for I use your foes prepared. Blessed Jesus, you have brought us in your God. Blessed Jesus, you have brought us yours we are. Please befriend us.
No, I have some.
Be the
Right here.
guardian of
Right
our
here.
way.
You need to empty your
Keep your flock from sin defender. Seek us when we go astray. Blessed Jesus.
All right. So I gave us about a minute and a half or so there. Students love sharing this, and I'm used to students talking when I'm talking, so please don't feel ashamed at all. If you have questions that come up, you want to share with someone some thoughts that you have as we go through this. I enjoy that. I don't like it when it's awkwardly quiet because I work with middle school boys and they do not want to be quiet. So totally used to it. What's going to happen here in a moment is Julie is going to be great, and she's going to walk around with the mic, and I want to hear from the audience. And what I want you to share, if you don't mind raising your hand at this point, it's going to feel a lot like a classroom. Sorry that it feels a lot like a classroom. I'm used to that. And so she's going to walk around with the mic, and I want to hear from some of the audience, maybe 2 or 3 out of the audience. And I don't want you to share necessarily what you had. I mean, if you have something great that you really want to share with everybody, I would love to hear it. But if you have something that someone else said, the person that you were sharing with, that you were really impressed with, or just you really enjoyed the insight that they gave, it would be great if you would share what they shared. I would love to hear that. So if you have your hands up and you have some insight that you heard from someone next to you that you really want to share, I'd love to hear it.
Hi, I'm Laura. So my husband and I were talking about, we've been studying all through Luke, and we were talking about how puzzling it is that Jesus would tell people not to tell other people. He did that with the demons, and it just has happened several times so far in Luke, and we don't know why, and yet everyone knew. So that's interesting. He tells people not to tell, and yet the word still spreads.
I had that exact same question. So we're about to talk about that here in a bit. I'm glad you brought that up. So that is awesome. You get an A+.
Hi, I'm Steve. Daniel, you may not know my friend Byron,
Goodbye.
but I think you guys collaborated because he was reading this passage this week and went off the Chatfield Reservoir for some solitude. You can't make this stuff up.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Byron.
All right, since he brought me in. Well, Jeff shared with me, he didn't say, go, don't tell anybody. But he did say, go tell the priest.
Yeah. All right. Oh, one more.
My name is Linda, and the one thing that we came up with too was, the person said, if you are willing. And that to me is different than other miracles that we've seen. And that he said, I am willing to make the whole process start.
Yeah.
So I'm Renee, and this is my son, in whom I am very proud. Alyssa, his wife, mentioned the same thing, that why did he tell the man not to tell him? Because Jesus was always telling the disciples, go and tell, come and see. So why would he tell this man, except the priest, to go tell the priest? Why would he do that?
All right. So with that, we're going to, any other thoughts?
Going twice.
All right.
All righty.
So I'm really glad that that came up, because there's a couple, we're going to answer these. We're going to look into these. We're going to dive into these. And we're going to hopefully pull out some things that we can apply to our own life from this message. So if we can get the passage back up on the screen here, the very first verse, verse 12. While Jesus was in one of the towns, a man came along who was covered with leprosy. And when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face to the ground. And here's what he says. There wasn't a question mark here. At the very end, you notice that it's a period. It's a statement. And so it's not a question of, Lord, if you can heal me, but the implied question is, are you willing to heal me? And I think that Jesus was really impressed with the boldness of this leper. In fact, when you look at the stories, when Jesus talks about prayer, when Jesus talks about whenever he has a healing experience, it's not timidity that impresses Jesus, but it's boldness that impresses Jesus over and over again. We see that in his preachings on prayer, in his healings. Like, for example, the faith of the centurion. If you guys have been watching The Chosen, that recently came up. The faith of the woman who was healed, who had been bleeding, that was another example that was recently brought up. All these stories are cases where someone was bold enough to go out of their comfort zone, out of their way, and boldly sought Jesus. The ifs of the healing stories don't come from a place of timidity, but from a place of humility. Jesus wants us to approach with boldness, but with an understanding that we are in desperate need of him. We can't fix ourselves. This man could not fix his leprosy himself. He still needed Jesus, and he came to him with boldness, but also with humility, understanding that Jesus did not have to do this. And so the question again was if Jesus was willing, not could Jesus do this. And it's with that kind of mindset that we should approach God in prayer, of boldness, of assurance, and of humility. And that's how we should approach him. And then in verse 13, what was really interesting to me, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. It doesn't begin with a phrase. It doesn't begin with Jesus responding to the man's words. Instead, he reaches out his hand and touches the man with leprosy. If you know anything about leprosy, that act in itself would make Jesus unclean. It would make him ceremonially unclean. And instead of responding with words, he touches the man without hesitation. The man who had probably never felt touch for most of his life. Never felt that physical touch of another person. And I've heard it said, being a teacher, I hear this all the time from other teachers, that you need at least seven instances of physical touch a day to feel fulfilled. At least, minimum of 7. And now put yourself in the shoes of the leper who's never felt someone's touch in years. And the first thing this man does, this rabbi does, is take him by the hand, touch him. And then he says, be clean. He is made clean. when I was in college, I hope do we have a picture of this? We're going to have a picture of my friends. No, we don't. Okay. All right. Okay. So when I was in college, I participated in a ministry called Sojourners. And in this ministry, we would go to 16th Street, we'd go to Colfax. Typically, this would be on Thursday evenings, and we would go off in pairs or even groups of 3 or so. And we would do a ministry to those who were living on the streets. We would often we would bring food, we'd bring blankets, we'd bring sleeping bags, sweaters, whatever we had, usually as a way of meeting someone's needs, but also having an opportunity to start a conversation to share the gospel. That was kind of our intent. And I had a lot of good conversations from that time. I loved meeting these people, but one thing that really stuck out to me was when I would go up to someone, they never wanted to make eye contact. That seemed to be the case all the time. In fact, I read a book recently called When Helping Hurts, and maybe some of you have read that before, and it talks about how to help those who are in low income situations without making things worse. And they did a survey of 60,000 low income families. And here are some of the common thoughts. They were asked the question, what does poverty mean to you? That was what they were asked. And here are the common thoughts and phrases that came up from those interviews. Shame, loss of hope, lack of dignity, powerlessness. It was more than just material poverty. That did come up, but more often than not, it was the idea of almost being second class, being unnoticed, untouchable, if you will. That's the kind of situation this man's in. In fact, he can't even go inside the towns and the villages and be around people and have a social setting like we're lucky enough to have here. He had to live outside of the towns, this man with leprosy. And when I would meet these people in wherever they were at, 16th Street Mall, Colfax, and sometimes we'd be lucky enough to have a situation where we could send them to a shelter to get food, water, shelter, all that. They were surprised that we wanted to have a conversation. That was the surprising thing, like the food and the clothing and things like that seemed to be like, okay, thank you for this. But it almost, I wouldn't say it was expected, but it was not uncommon for that to happen. But what was uncommon was the conversation. And at the beginning, I was very prideful. I knew all the arguments about Christianity. I knew how to share the gospel. I knew all the right answers. Not once did I ever share the gospel in a way that someone said, I want to put my faith in Jesus from those arguments. I knew how to defend the Bible. But what I found at the end of my time doing this was that just ask good questions and care. That's all anyone wants, is to be seen and heard and understood that they're not shameful because they're in a situation where they're not in a house, because they can't maybe afford the food or the clothing. Instead, taking the time to sit down with someone and just listen. That was what they want. That's what anyone wants. And that was the most powerful thing I learned from time. And so this man with leprosy is approached by a rabbi who notices him, touches him, meets that need, but then listens to him and says, be clean.
Come on. Why?
And at the end of this, after dealing with the man with leprosy, he hasn't met anybody. He's been in social isolation. He's sitting outside the town. And when he goes to the town, what's more is he has to yell out, unclean, unclean, unclean. Anytime he'd have to go into town, he'd have to wear a mask, and then he'd have to go through the town shouting, unclean, unclean. So everyone knew he had something that was infectious. So not only was it when he went around people, he had to be away from people, but when he was around people, he had to let everyone know that I'm unclean. Hey, look at me, I'm unclean. And people would look away and they'd go away from him. That's the life he's living. That's the situation he's living in. And what I found working as a teacher is that if you say something about yourself enough, you begin to believe it. It doesn't just become ceremonially unclean. It becomes, I am unclean. I am shameful. I am something to be ashamed of. And he said this for years and years and years. And I work with math students too, by the way. I'm a Bible teacher, but I also work with math students. And one of the things I found about my math students is that they have a tendency, and I work with the low students, the students not in the higher level math, not in the middle level math, but in the lower level math. I worked with them in fifth grade,
Have a
now I'm
phone
working with them in
call.
sixth grade. And what I found is they have a tendency to say, I hate math. I suck at math. I'm stupid.
It's Dawn.
I hear these things every day almost, at least on a weekly basis. And I have to stop them and I have to correct them and tell them, you are not stupid. You are intelligent, you know math, you can do this stuff. You just have to get some practice with it. And you have to believe that you can do it. And when I started with them, they were averaging in B's and C's, kind of the lower grades. And then what I found successful was not just the practice, because the practice was important. If you see something, you do it enough, you're going to master it. You do something 1,000 times, you're going to master that. And they're beginning to see that it's not that I'm dumb. I need some more practice with this stuff. But then when they noticed that they could do it, and I kept catching them and getting on them about talking negatively about themselves, they began to actually believe that they could do it, that they were worthy of doing this, and that they could participate in this stuff. And now we're averaging B's across the board. I'm not doing this to toot my own horn, but I'm saying this because what they believed about themselves, they made come true. And then when they began to believe that, hey, I can do this if I just practice at it, then they actually tried and they did well. And this man who had been telling himself, I am unclean, I am unclean, I am unclean, I am shameful, I am unworthy. Now this rabbi comes to him and says, you are clean. And it changes his whole life. It's more than just a physical healing, which we see that in this story, but it's a spiritual healing and it's an emotional healing. A man who had been told his whole life one thing is now able to believe another. That's the kind of healing that Jesus offers us. And then he says, go present yourself according to the law of Moses. And I asked myself, well, what is this ceremony? Like, what is this that he's supposed to go and do? And it's in Leviticus 14. I'm not going to bore you with all the details on Leviticus 14. There's a lot of stuff to it, but there's a couple things I wanted to point out. They used hyssop in this ceremony, which basically is a paintbrush. Anyone have any idea of where the hyssop was used before this? Any ideas? It's in Exodus, for those of you who may remember what that's about. The hyssop was used as a paintbrush, and they would go up to the doors during the Exodus, painted their doors with the blood of the lamb as a sign of protection from the angel that took the life of Pharaoh's son. This same paintbrush is used in this ceremony. This ceremony is supposed to represent a freedom from slavery of that sin and that disease and into a new freedom and life. That's what this ceremony represents. And Jesus says, we do that ceremony. Not only because he's required to, but also because he's trying to tell this man, you are free. You are free. But then Jesus does something really strange. And we see this in other stories too, like what was mentioned from the congregation. He says, don't tell anyone. In fact, he says, exactly, don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priests and offer the sacrifices of Moses, which we just talked about, for the cleansing and as a testimony to them. The first part I really want to stop on here. Don't tell anyone. Why would someone who did something miraculous like this not want to continue that momentum? I mean, that makes sense, right? You just did a miracle. You want people to know about it. If you want to make the kingdom of heaven more crowded, then why not continue that momentum that you've started with this amazing healing? And so I did a little bit of digging. And here's what I found. The expectation was that there was eventually going to be a Messiah that would come. And I think we're familiar with that word, Messiah. It's just the idea of a leader in the Israelite community that would eventually become their king. But here's some expectations of that Messiah. One of the expectations was that he'd be a healer, which we see in the Psalms. We see that in the book of Isaiah. We see that in multiple Old Testament books. And so they're looking for this healer. And Jesus, he comes in and he's healing these people. And they're like, okay, well, maybe this is the Messiah. He's also going to be a prophet and someone who's going to cleanse the people and lead the people, which that part we see in Jesus as well. But here's the part, the expectation that they also had that Jesus would not fulfill. That was the expectation of being a warrior. See, they expected this Messiah to be a warrior like the Maccabees a few hundred years before this, a few hundred years before Jesus came, that he would be this warrior leader that would come in, kick out the Romans, free the Holy Land, and then lead his people, and his descendants would be kings over Israel for many, many years. And that was the expectation of the Messiah. In fact, we see this in John 6:15, where he goes and he has this miracle performed, he has this teaching, and then the people are like, well, let's make him king. And it says that they tried to make him king by force. Why? Because they wanted a warrior leader, a Messiah, who would come in, kick out the Romans in a war, and then create this freedom from Rome. Because that's the culture they were living. They were taken over by the Babylonians, they were taken over by the Assyrians, they were taken over by all these other kingdoms, and now they're under Rome's rule, and they want to be freed from Rome's rule. And if you watch The Chosen, just another plug there for that, it'll give you a really good idea of like the culture that's happening there and what the Romans are doing. And they do a really good job of showing that. And so in that world, their expectation is this Messiah is going to be a warrior. He's going to lead us into battle. And Jesus said, no, that is not the way. Turn the other cheek. Give your cloak up. Instead of walking 1 mile, walk 2 miles with them. These are the kind of things that the kingdom of heaven is supposed to be, not a kingdom of war. The exact opposite of their expectations. And that's why he says, don't spread the word. I don't want this to become a thing where Rome is going to send in their army because they think this Messiah is coming to lead a war, and then he's going to crush my people. Don't spread the word, because that's what will happen. And because he refuses to do this, that's why I think Judas does what he does later on in the story. He had a different expectation. And there's a lot more we could dive into on that, but we're not going to do that today. And then at the end of this, in verse 16, so Jesus has basically said, don't share this, but the word still gets out. And again, in the ceremony, when the man walks in, he walks through the village, and everybody in town is going to see this. The man who was outside of the community is now being led into the most sacred and holy place of that community, into the very center of that community, which is in the Old Testament, the tabernacle. In the New Testament, it's the temple. And the priests are walking with him, showing that, hey, he is okay to be a part of this society again. And how often is that the case for us, where we need to go out of our way to show everyone that we want to be a part of our groups? I work with middle schoolers, and I can't tell you how often my middle schoolers will create these cliques and these groups that they want to be a part of, and someone is left out. And as an adult, it becomes a little different. It's centered maybe more around politics than it is around looks or maybe other things, but maybe it's centered around politics. Maybe it's centered around religion. And those are the things that kind of create this separation, even within churches, where people separate from each other because of different views. But Christ comes in and he says, no, you are to be a part of this family and a part of this community. And you do this by going into the very sacred place that only the priest could go, and you're going to go with him. And then after all this happens, he does this healing, does this amazing miracle. We go into verse 16. And it says that Jesus often withdrew to a lonely place and prayed. I love doing youth ministry. I have some parents here in the audience, and I got to work with their students. It was a very special time for me to work with the students here. But one of the things I found is that the students at their, we call it pacing, but the students at this stage in their life, what's the most important area of their life right now as students? It's in the term. They're in school. And so what I found was the most effective place I could be in terms of ministry. And I kept telling God, I don't want to be a youth pastor. I don't want to be a youth minister. I don't want to do that. I want to be a pastor that gets to preach and work with adults. And that is just not the door that he's opened for me. As much as I want to do one thing, he was calling me into another, and is continuing to call me into another. And what we see here is Jesus pacing himself in verse 16, that he would go and perform these miracles and then he would retreat. That was a pace for him, but he would go into the midst of the people a lot. And for me, what pacing meant was go where the students are at. And that was in the school system. And that's where I'm at now. And I found that if you take the time and you pace with these students and you go to their sports games, you help them in their tests. So instead of saying, oh, it's going to be okay, we'll pray for that test, I get to be the one that gives the test. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing. But it gives me a lot more opportunity to see into their world, to pace with them, to walk with them. And the one thing I found from this is that in the school system, we are taught to be efficient. You're going to read efficiently. You're going to do math efficiently. You're going to use your time wisely. I've said that many times. But there's nothing about relationships that's efficient. There's nothing about working with people that's efficient. Right now, I'm using all this time. Look at who's speaking right now. Nothing efficient about it. And one of the things I love to do in my class, that I get to do in my class, is I get to slow them down. They go into English class and they are write, read, take these tests. Social studies is super fast paced. Math is super fast paced. Science is very fast paced. But when it gets to Bible, I get to slow them down. You're going to take 10 minutes and you're going to read the scriptures. And you're going to finish really soon. You're going to finish really quick. Read it again. And then we go outside a lot of times. We go to this lake that's behind the school. And I take them there and we have a conversation about what we read. I'm not standing up and like just telling them what to know about the scriptures. They're digging into it themselves. We sit in a circle. We call it a Socratic circle a lot. And we just enjoy the creation that God's given us. We slow down. It takes time. I mean, it takes time to walk over to this lake. I'm using class time, valuable class time to walk over to this lake. But every year, when I get to talk with these students, one of their favorite parts of school is when we get to go out to the lake and talk about God's word. Because we slow down, everyone gets to talk, and we get to hear from each other and be with each other. It's all about relationships, is what my youth pastor used to say. And we see that in our classroom. And I'm really intentional about that. And at the back of my classroom, when you look, as they leave, they have to smack this space above the door. And on that space, it says family. Because that's what God invites us into, as a family. That's what this leper was invited into, was a family, the family of God. He was invited back into the family of God. And I tell them that every time you leave this place, remember that you're a family. You got to slap that little thing, kind of like a sports, in the sports realm where they smack the top of the thing. It has something encouraging on their way out to the game, whatever that is. That's our game. Our game is not with each other. It's not a competition. It's not with each other. It's not with flesh and blood. It's against spirits, principalities, powers. But we're in this together as a family. And what we say in here stays in here. And what we talk about in here is going to bring us together as a family, and we're going to use that to encourage each other and to look forward to the time when Christ returns and gives us that full family meal. I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until I'm with you again. That's the meal that we look forward to. And I look around here, and even though it seems like a smaller setting, there's something special about a small setting, about a family. And I appreciate that all the more. I wouldn't give that up for the world. And I hope you wouldn't either. I had a quote up here. It's not up here, unfortunately. But it says, God saved the world at 3 miles an hour. He didn't save the world, with internet, cars, planes, microphones. He saved the world walking with 12 men and some women in there too. And he had a relationship with each and every one of them. He didn't try to get as many as possible. He just tried to get to know the ones that he had as much as possible. And that's the kind of world that we need to live in a world where it's so easy to get on social media, to get on Facebook, to get on emails, to be texting, to isolate yourself in your car. The world that Jesus lived in is a world where he sat down with people, had a meal, and genuinely got to know them. And we see that in the story of the leper. So my encouragement to us today is to take advantage of that. Take advantage of the time that you have with each other, that compassion that Jesus gave to us. Live with that compassion, love each other, and get to know each other deeply. Because this only lasts for so long. And if you're wondering what that's like, if you're wondering what it means to be a part of that family, what we're going to do here in a minute is I'm going to invite you into that family. We're going to have a time of prayer. And if you pray this prayer, and if you feel that tugging, that movement of the Spirit saying, pray this prayer. If you haven't committed your life to me, pray it. Don't ignore that. Don't take that for granted. Listen to God. Listen to the Spirit as he pulls on your heart. And if there's someone that you know that needs this prayer, pray for them. Take this time to pray for them, that they would become a part of this family. That through faith, they would be saved and walk away from the shame and the guilt that comes with this world and accept that freedom that Christ offers. So now I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to ask everyone to bow their heads. And if you want to become a part of this family, and when I say family, I mean become a Christian, a part of the Christian family of Christ. I ask that you pray this prayer with me. You can pray it silently to yourself, or you can pray it out loud, whatever works for you. Heavenly Father, I come before you. I recognize that I am a sinner. I recognize that this world has taught me that I am unclean. In this moment, thank you for making me clean. Thank you for your forgiveness. I make you my Lord at this moment and for the rest of my life. Help me to follow you. Help me to bring grace to those around me. Fill me with compassion. Fill me with love.